Kazia is developing what I think is shaping up to be one of the most important developments for the treatment of brain cancer for many decades. Its lead drug, paxalisib, is on a clear path to commercialisation, and I can make this statement as confidently as Kazia reported interim data in April, which suggested that paxalisib had the potential to extend life for patients with glioblastoma. There's a lot more to Kazia than that, but I might at this stage leave my intro there and pass over to James to deliver his presentation. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to present at what I understand to be the inaugural IRD Invest conference, and it's a great opportunity for us to share an update on Kazia. I'm conscious there are people attending today who are very familiar with the Kazia story and others who are very new to the story. So I'm going to position this presentation as something of an overview of the Kazia story, and then hopefully get into a little bit more detail in some of the questions that follow. So if we move forward here a little bit, I think there's really three things that I want to just reinforce about Kazia. As I say, these are not new points to those who've followed our story over the last couple of years, but these really get to the crux of where we think the value in our company lies. And the first thing is to say something about the disease area we're focusing on. As was touched on in the introduction, we're developing a drug for glioblastoma, which is the most common and the most aggressive form of brain cancer. This is widely seen as one of the most challenging targets in modern cancer research. It's a disease that's been very resistant to new therapies. And we think we have an extremely promising opportunity with paxalisib, our lead drug, to change that story. And we'll talk through some of that data in a few moments. But glioblastoma, as I say, the most common and the most aggressive form of brain cancer, and conservatively a $1.5 billion market for a drug. So not just an important opportunity to change outcome for patients, but a very important commercial opportunity for us as a business as well. Now, paxalisib, our lead program, we think is a very, very strong contender here. And there are several reasons for this. Paxalisib belongs to a class of drugs called PI3K inhibitors, one of those magnificent names that we come up with in our industry. But this is really important because there are 4 FDA-approved PI3K inhibitors. This is a really well-understood, well-researched area of medicine. We know that PI3K inhibitors work as a treatment for various forms of cancer. So we have that very, very encouraging history behind us. But the unique thing for paxalisib, the thing that sets our drug aside from every other drug in this class, in the global pipeline, is the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier, the ability to get into the brain. And obviously, for any drug that presumes to try and treat brain cancer, being able to get into the brain, being able to get to the tumor is critical. And that's really the unique differentiating feature for paxalisib. And this is a particularly important pathway because the vast majority of glioblastoma patients have some sort of alteration in this PI3K mechanism. It's part of the biochemical underpinnings of cancer, and it's almost ubiquitous for this disease. So we have a drug that's in a well-validated class. It hits a mechanism which is very relevant for this disease, and it's the only drug of its kind that can get to the tumor. So we think it's got a terrific theoretical rationale for glioblastoma. And that rationale has been starting to play out in some of the very promising clinical data we've been seeing in recent months. So we're currently in a phase 2 clinical study. As many people on the video feed will be aware, there are classically 3 phases to the development of a drug. We're just completing phase 2, and I'll come to it in a little bit more detail. We've been seeing some great data out of that, which I'll go into in a short while. We're just about to get into a pivotal study, a registration study, sometimes called a phase 3 study. We expect to be in a position to start that before the end of this year. And that will be the final step on the journey for paxalisib to becoming a commercial product. So we're very advanced in the long drawn out process of drug development. We're getting really positive data so far. And so we think we're on the home stretch in a certain sense in terms of the development of this drug. So let me get into a little bit more detail here. And I think the first thing to say about brain cancer is that this has been a really tough space for new drug development. In the last 20 years, we've really only seen one new drug approved here, Avastin, which you can see here on this slide. That's approved only for a small proportion of very late stage patients. In fact, it isn't approved at all here in Australia. And this is really different from other diseases like lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, where we've seen a rush of new drugs. And I think it reflects certain features of glioblastoma. One of those features is the difficulty of developing drugs to cross the blood-brain barrier. It's an enormous technical challenge. But I think it's fair to say this is also a disease that's been neglected by Big Pharma. My role prior to coming to Kazia was as a senior executive with Sanofi, a large French pharmaceutical company. And we really almost pointedly tried to avoid brain cancer. It was not something very much on our radar. And that's really been changing the last few years. And in fact, if we look at the effort that's going on globally in this disease, it's young, smaller companies like Kazia that are really changing this. And I think as the rest of the industry becomes more focused on brain cancer, it really means that we're in a prime position to leverage that interest. And we're seeing that trend happening right now. Now, glioblastoma is not as common as lung cancer or breast cancer, but it's by no means a rare disease. There's about 130,000 patients a year worldwide affected with this disease. And as I touched on earlier in the presentation, that represents a commensurate commercial opportunity of somewhere around $1.5 billion US per annum. This is a disease where the prognosis really hasn't changed for more than 20 years. It's still about a 12 to 15 month life expectancy from diagnosis. And the 5-year survival rate is very close to nil. And you can see here from some of the sort of well-known Australian patients and in one case US patient that this is a disease that can really affect anybody at any point in their life. It's not a disease with particular risk factors or associations, something that can come out of the blue and really affects just about anybody. We have patients in our clinical trials in their 30s and 40s. This is not uniformly a disease of older people. It's sadly a disease that can strike anybody at any point in their life. Now, the current treatment is, as shown here, patients when they're diagnosed with glioblastoma go through 3 steps of treatment. They have surgery, first of all, to remove as much of the tumor as possible. And that's then followed by radiotherapy, which removes the little deposits of tumor that are left. And then they go on to a drug called Temozolamide, also known as Temodar, which they take for up to 6 months to try and slow the recurrence of the disease. Now, unfortunately, this treatment is never curative. In all cases, the disease will eventually progress. And unfortunately, that's true of many cancers at the moment. Very, very few cancer therapies, unfortunately, can claim to cure the disease. But successful cancer therapies can at least buy patients time, and they can gradually move the acute challenge of a cancer diagnosis to something more like a chronic disease. And for some patients, temozolomide achieves that. For about 1/3 of patients, it will extend life by somewhere between 6 and 7 months. But for the remaining 2/3 of patients, temozolomide provides no therapeutic benefit of any significance. And for those 2/3 of patients, there are no alternative therapies. There are no other drugs which are approved for first-line use. And so that's where we're focusing with paxalisib at the outset. We're trying to develop our drug for the 2/3 of patients who will never respond to the existing standard of care. And uniquely, we can identify those patients in advance. We can do a genetic test on the tumor sample that will tell in advance whether patients will ever respond to temozolomide. And so we can identify our patients very cleanly, very easily, right at the outset of their treatment. And for those that don't respond, the idea is that we will put them onto paxalisib instead. Now, I mentioned earlier paxalisib is part of this class of PI3K inhibitors, and that's a really, really relevant class for glioblastoma. As I say, 85 to 90% of patients have a disorder of their PI3K pathway in this disease. But it's also really important for investors because this is really well understood. This is mainstream cancer medicine. There are 4 approved drugs in this class now. They work, they're used to treat different forms of cancer. So we understand the PI3K pathway really well. But as I mentioned, and crucially, the unique feature of paxalisib is this ability to cross the blood-brain barrier, this ability to get to a brain tumor. And that's something that none of these 4 approved therapies will ever be able to do. So we have this really nice mix, this balance between a very well-proven, well-understood, well-substantiated mechanism, but a unique differentiating feature that sets our drug aside from every other drug in the global pipeline. And I mentioned at the top of the call that we've been seeing some really promising data out of the ongoing clinical trial program. And we're currently in a phase 2 clinical study in glioblastoma, and it's in those patients who are resistant to temozolomide, so exactly the patients we're targeting for our commercial population. And what we've seen so far is some really promising data, which I've summarized here. Now, we've looked first of all at a measure called progression-free survival. This is a measure of the ability of the drug to delay recurrence of the tumor. Bear in mind, all these patients have had surgery, so on an MRI scan, most of them don't have measurable tumor, but we know that given time, in every case, it will come back. Progression-free survival measures the ability of the drug to delay that process. And with paxalisib, we've seen progression-free survival of about 8.5 months. Now, the comparison here for temozolomide, the existing therapy, is 5.3 months. So it seems like our drug is delaying recurrence of the tumor, and in quite a meaningful way. But even better than that, the gold standard for any new drug is the ability to extend life. And in that score, we've seen overall survival so far of 17.7 months for paxalisib, which compares to 12.7 months for temozolomide, the existing drug. And that's really quite a marked difference. Now, these comparisons are always a little bit imperfect. We're comparing against historical data from another study. So we can never say that this sort of data is absolutely definitive. But we do know that if this holds out in a larger randomized controlled study, if paxalisib and temozolomide both continue to behave in the way we have, we should have a very viable commercial product at the end of this. Now, that's our focus, but we do have a lot of other things going on with paxalisib. We do have 4 other clinical studies underway, and then, of course, a planned pivotal study called GBM Agile, which we expect to be able to start by the end of this year. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go into detail about the 4 other studies, but they are briefly, one in childhood brain cancer called DIPG, and then 3 others in brain metastases, which is cancer that has spread to the brain from elsewhere in the body. At least 2 of these studies are expected to produce data by the end of this calendar year. So we have quite a rich program going on. All of these other studies are actually primarily funded by the institutions that are running them. So we have a really nice position in Kazia whereby we're able to leverage that external investment to the tune of many millions of dollars to collect additional data about our drug. And potentially this makes paxalisib not just a glioblastoma drug, but a brain cancer drug in a much broader sense. And that's important because the commercial opportunity here becomes very significant as you broaden out from glioblastoma. As I mentioned, glioblastoma is itself about a $1.5 billion market. But beyond that, these other indications like childhood brain cancer and brain metastases really represent many billions of dollars of potential market opportunity. And then beyond that, we see the potential to use our drug in other forms of cancer where PI3K is activated. That includes lung cancer, breast cancer, certain forms of blood cancer. And there's no respect really in which our drug is any less than those 4 FDA-approved drugs already in the class. So once we're approved in brain cancer, we have the ability to go and look at some of these very large, very rich indications as a long-term opportunity for the drug. Now, I talk a lot about commercialization because that's really starting to get quite imminent for paxalisib, but it's not a given that Kazia will be the company to take the drug to the finish line. The fate of many companies in our position is to partner with larger companies or even to be acquired by larger companies. And that's certainly part of our thinking about the potential destiny of paxalisib and Kazia. And I've shown here some indicative, illustrative transactions that have happened in the last 12 months or so that give a sense of the kind of opportunity that these sorts of deals can present to investors. Now, we remain very open in Kazia about how we take this drug forward, whether we continue to progress ourselves or whether we partner at an earlier stage or at a later stage. But I think it's important to note that these sort of things can occur at any time in the development of the drug. Finally, just a couple of things to say in a more corporate sense. We've met all our milestones to date with the paxalisib program. We have some key ones coming up, chiefly around data readouts from both our own study and ongoing studies in other forms of brain cancer. And then as a company, we're about a $55 million market cap as of today. We're financially in a strong position. We completed a financing round in April and May of this year that raised in aggregate $9 million before costs. And we've had the good fortune in several recent financing rounds to be very well supported on good terms by leading sector specialist institutional investors. So we've been really grateful for that investor support, and it's helped us to obviously move the program forward to where it is now. So I'm going to conclude there and open to questions. I just say finally, though, that there is a wealth of information on our website, and I really encourage interested investors to go and consult some of the resources there. We're always delighted to talk to investors, and there's our corporate email address there. We do have analyst coverage as well from both Bell Potter and Edison Research, and that's also, I think, a valuable resource for many of our investors. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And I'd like to open to questions.
Terrific. Thank you, James. Okay, so we have had quite a few questions come through. I think we've got until about 10:55 to get through. We'll get through as many as we can. So the first question relates to analyst research. Do you anticipate any reputable banks or institutions initiating coverage on Kazia?
So obviously it's challenging for us to talk about people that may in the future initiate coverage, but we do currently have coverage from two research analysts. We have John Hester at Bell Potter is covering us, and then at least at present, John Savin at Edison Research. And so we're lucky to have two avenues of our analyst research, and we try to put as much as we can on the website so that those reports are as widely available as possible.
Thank you. Next question, do you anticipate having to raise capital again anytime in the near future?
Well, we're a pre-revenue company, and so any young biotech startup like ourselves goes through several rounds of financing generally before it's able to make money and start returning value to investors. Now, we obviously still have some work ahead of us in the development of this drug, but I think there's quite a few different ways we can finance that. One option clearly is partnership, and that's something we continue to explore. We have been doing for several years now. And the opportunity to bring a larger company into the development of paxalisib in some form, I think, just becomes more real and more tangible as each data readout matures. And that potentially could take care of everything we need through to the finish line. We also look at things like grant opportunities. We've had some efforts here in Australia, which sadly have been not as successful as we would have hoped so far. But we've also been looking to the US, which I think is a rather more sophisticated market for grants. So that's another opportunity that may help us to fund this work. We do have obviously a good amount of capital in the bank as well. Now, if beyond that we need to raise money additionally in further financing rounds, I think, as I said, we're fortunate that we have strong support from investors that should help us to do that. So I think it's fair to say we've got a lot of levers to move here to finance the company, and I think we take that as we need to as things move forward.
Thank you. We have a few here that relate to the recent paxalisib data. The first is, were the progression-free survival and overall survival numbers statistically significant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So our study is actually a single-arm study. So all the patients in the study are treated with paxalisib. Now, statistical significance only actually applies to studies where there are two arms, and it applies to the comparison between one arm and another. When a study only has one arm, no matter how many patients are and how strong the results are, it's technically impossible for it to demonstrate statistical significance because there is no comparator within the study. So the short answer is no, but the reason is that the structure of the study, the single arm nature of the study, means that we can't demonstrate statistical significance. Now, as I say, were these results to be replicated in a randomized controlled study, that's to say a study with a comparator arm, and were we to continue to see that magnitude of benefit, then I think it probably would not require a lot of patients to show statistical significance. So it's very positive, but because of the way the study's set up, we can't claim statistical significance quite yet.
Got it. Okay. All right. And this may be our final question, James, another one about paxalisib. So has it been given to patients that do respond to the existing standard of care?
It has. It's mainly been given in the later stages of treatment. So obviously, there's treatment that I described where patients have surgery, radiotherapy, and then treatment with temozolomide. That's what we call first-line treatment. That's the treatment of a newly diagnosed patient. Now, sadly, in this disease, every patient will eventually fail that regimen. And when they do, they become eligible for other treatments, both proven and experimental. Now, some of the early data we've had in paxalisib was given in that context. It was given very late-stage patients who had failed had failed the first-line treatment. And what we did see there was some really good evidence that paxalisib, A, gets into the tumor, B, that it affects the biology of the tumor in exactly the way we're expecting, but also that in some patients, it was causing shrinkage of the tumor. Now, because these were very, very late stage patients and most of them got very small doses of paxalisib, we didn't see what we call a partial response, which is a particular threshold of tumor shrinkage. But we definitely see some patients with tumor shrinkage, and we see other patients where the tumor is stabilized. So, and some of those patients were previous responders to temozolomide. So we do certainly get a good feel that our drug works more broadly than the patient population we're targeting, but as a gateway indication, as a way to get the drug approved, this is the group of patients that we think makes the most sense.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much for presenting today, James. There's a huge amount of exciting news in your future. So we look forward to following on with that. Anybody that is interested in following Kazia can do so via the website or by signing up for email alerts. And thanks again for your time today.